Sup bitches? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter at Grinosaur and at Mort_post for official announcements.
Hello lovelies, let's have a little chat about this Crowdfunding Trust Alliance thing between IndieGoGo and GoFundMe for now and probably others in the future. What is it? So it seems to be an attempt to address problems with fraud and repeated exploitation by people who are crowdfunding of backers and so on, an attempt to increase trust in crowdfunding again. What it amounts to is, at least at IndieGoGo, increased manual review, sharing information between platforms that join this alliance, more backer protection, risk assessment, denying people when they try to set up crowdfunding, and banning people in bans that will end up being across platform. They say their main reason for doing so is because people are setting up GoFundMe's and IndieGoGo's and other crowdfunding specifically to exploit people and to rip them off, and that they want to try and mitigate that to some extent. There is a lot of exploitation that goes on these platforms, people overpromising, failing to deliver, things like solar roadways or self-filling bottles of water. Thunderfoot does a lot of takedowns of this sort of thing, but there are other ones as well, like various rip-offs of old computer games and things that people get into, setting them up not really knowing anything about intellectual property rights or whatever else, raising a lot of money and then going down in flames. So far, so good, so what, right? Well, people are up in arms about this, especially in groups like Comicsgate and so on. It looks like it's not much, but their wariness and concern is perfectly reasonable if it's understood in context, and that context being that the screws are being turned down on all forms of raising money if you're a bit edgy or your ideology doesn't match the people who are running the platforms, things like that. So is it censorship? Potentially. In this case, we've seen censorship in other instances. Censorship is anything that suppresses speech, whether you think it's justified or not. So the argument is usually, or should usually, be over whether censorship is justified, not over whether something is censorship or not. Basically, there is no trust for institutions like this, whether it be banks, pseudo-banks like PayPal, crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, IndieGoGo, the media. There is just basically no trust left for any of these companies in many quarters. It's not just right-wing people or conservatives or objectionable types, baskets of deplorables. It's people all over the spectrum. The left, the real left, gets hit by this stuff almost as much as anyone else does. So we've seen all these examples of things going wrong and of censorship, like Tentacle Bento getting knocked off Kickstarter, things like that. We've seen unionization at Kickstarter being driven not so much by a desire for better pay and working conditions, but for a desire to have veto rights over projects, whether they can use the platform or not. And we've seen similar things going on with other efforts at places like Paizo and so on. It's there's a lot of pressure there on these companies to censor, much of it coming from their own employees, ironically and strangely enough. So understood in that context, people's reaction, people's concern, people's worry about ideological and content gatekeeping and so on, which has already happened to adult workers and adult projects and so on, it's a concern because it has already happened on Kickstarter, it has already happened on Patreon. OnlyFans almost succumbed not so long ago, of all places. So when you see something like this, you can understand why people are reading between the lines and thinking, this is going to be used to blacklist us from all crowdfunding platforms if we tick someone off at one of them in the wrong way. And then we're going to have nowhere else to go, really, though they're only accepting established platforms. So, that is the real worry. The gatekeeping thing, it's not an unreasonable or irrational concern. And the danger of being blacklisted from all these companies is a real and rational concern. My concern isn't necessarily so much on that until we see it happen, but I do have some genuine concerns. There are real reasons why projects don't necessarily deliver. Crowdfunding isn't supposed to be a pre-order system. You're taking a risk. You're spending money as an investment in the person, in their project, because you believe in it, or maybe you want to hopefully get whatever it is that they produce cheaper and earlier than anyone else, and by backing, you get extra stuff. You get involved, you get acknowledgement. It's not a huge return on your investment, but you should view it as an investment, not buying a product. But there are reasons projects don't deliver. And I've had some of these happen to me, and I'm concerned that this may lead to being seen as an unreliable prospect and losing access to crowdfunding. For example, during the Gore project, things got backed up because the artist had a whole bunch of things happen to them that meant that they couldn't work. So it was over a year and a half late. But that's nobody's fault, and the project did eventually deliver. But that's not going to look good through this, is it? And how do you differentiate between real issues happening and between someone simply being lazy or having no intention on ever following up and finishing the project? I agonized over it and got it done. People like Zoe Quinn haven't necessarily. And projects can fail, they can not come together, the technology cannot work, and that's not anyone looking to rip you off necessarily. It's just that sometimes these things don't work out. Or my more recent crowdfunding project, Whitechester, no sooner had I started that off than I had a hypertensive episode and spent time in the hospital, and I've not been very well since. And didn't know that was going to happen. So the project is likely to be maybe a month or two late at the end of all this, even with all the help that I'm getting. But that doesn't look good either, does it? You could get complaint bombed by people if enough people don't like the content of the project that you're putting out there, and they decide to kick up a stink. Are they going to be able now to get that project taken down, removed? And is that going to lead to you getting blacklisted? Similar to the way people have used mobbing to knock people off Twitter or other social media. That's a concern. The real problems on these platforms are not these kind of things. The biggest problem, I think, on these platforms is that big companies who don't need to use crowdfunding to produce their projects are using crowdfunding to produce their projects. They're using it as a de facto pre-order system. Now, I've backed some of those projects, even though I have my misgivings about that, but crowdfunding was supposed to be for small, innovative, agile companies to have opportunities that were normally only available to larger companies that could get investors interested. It's not that anymore. Now, if this project deals with proven scammers and there are monetary reasons, rip-off reasons and so on for these things to be suppressed, that's all to the good, I think. But like everyone else, I think I'm very wary that this is going to end up being more than that. This is going to end up being gatekeeping and more creeping corporate censorship. People don't understand crowdfunding, that it is that investment, that it is that bet. And that leads to a great deal of the complaining that we see, and that's not helped by the big companies using it as a pre-order system. But that's basically the root of it all. There is no trust. There is no trust in these companies to do the right thing. And so the suspicion is warranted. and IndieGoGo and GoFundMe, this Crowdfunding Trust Alliance, anyone else who joins, they've got an uphill struggle to prove that they're not going to succumb to all these problems. Zang.
Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created Actual Fucking Monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.
Grim gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Grim goes to sleep, all of his friends go to sleep too. The people on the internet were just text on a screen, the collectibles were just cheap plastic tat, and the books were just elaborate sandwiches made of wood and paper. Even Grim himself, once he was asleep, was just an old, saggy goth twat, baggy and a bit loose at the seams, and nobody loved him.